Hello. Okay, we are live now. Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the plenary session number 5 tonight with Dr. Allison Karp. Allison is going to talk about heterogeneous savanna fire response to paleo-rainfall shifts. Allison is a molecular paleoecologist specializing in paleofire in gray sea systems. Her research focus on how wildfire has impacted terrestrial ecosystems, carbon cycles, and climate on geological timescales. She completed her PhD in Pennsylvania State University at the Department of Geoscience, and she is now a postdoc in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale University. Allison's work has contributed, amongst others, to the understanding of how feedbacks between changing fire, climate, and biotic interactions has led to abrupt landscape transitions on a variety of spatio-temporal scales. Allison, if you are ready, please go over. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here to speak today. I'm really excited to share some recent work with all of you, examining fire response specifically to rainfall shifts during the African humid period in the Holocene. So just to give a bit of background, savannas are an ecosystem that's widely distributed across the tropics and subtropics. And these open ecosystems are really maintained by fire feedbacks, and they're spread across a variety of different rainfalls, distributed from very arid to potentially very humid, rainfalls of up to 2,000 millimeters of rainfall a year. And there's a bistable region where you find both savanna and forest along this rainfall gradient, and the state that you can get and the state that's stable is somewhat dependent on fire activity. And so understanding fire in these systems is really important to understanding how they're maintained and how they may respond to shifts in the future. And we already know that fire activity is experiencing large changes historically. This is from some data from Andala and colleagues using the global burned area product from the last 20 years to examine large scale changes in burned area. And what they found is that overall burned area has been decreasing globally over the course of the last 20 years. And this is somewhat contrary to what we generally hear about in the news. We hear about large extreme fires increasing in the Western US, fires in the Amazon, but because savanna systems are actually responsible for the majority of annual wildfires and the fire activity in these systems is actually decreasing, this is really driving this shift. And while it seems like human factors and land use change might be responsible for these shifts, we know that fire is very intimately tied to climate, and we know that as climate shifts, this might actually impact how we expect fire to respond as well. And specifically in Africa and subtropical Africa, rainfall is expected to increase as our climate continues to warm. This is data from the an ensemble mean model indicating that under the RCP 8.5 scenario, subtropical Africa is expected to see anywhere from 10 to 55% increases in rainfall annually. And while this is showing the most extreme scenario, this is something that we definitely have to think about in the context of how it might affect fire activity in the future. And the reason for this, and the reason this is not necessarily a simple question, is because how fire activity responds to changes in rainfall can vary quite a bit depending on where a site sits on the rainfall gradient today. And the reason for this is that fire dynamics are moderated by the amount of fuel that's in a system. In savanna systems, fire is driven by the amount of grass biomass, and in the arid part of the rainfall gradient where fires are potentially limited by fuels, the correlation between grass biomass and annual rainfall is really important, because this means that if you have increased rainfall, you have increased grass biomass. And if you have increased grass biomass, you have increased probability of fire. And ultimately, we can see that this plays out at a really broad spatial scale, These are sites across Africa that have positive correlations between annual burned area and the previous year's annual rainfall. So sites that are fuel load limited. However, as you move further along the rainfall gradient into more humid and mesic sites, the relationship between fire and rainfall actually changes quite a bit, because in these sites, there's enough grass biomass to burn annually because they're wet, but it's actually the moisture that ends up being a limitation on fire. So if a site is too wet, then you will not have the ability to actually cure fuel and for fire to spread. So in this case, what we see is that fire is actually negatively correlated to dry season rainfall. So when there's more rainfall in the dry season or less seasonality, you have less propensity for fire. This is because fire spread is negatively correlated to fuel moisture. So fuels have to dry out enough for fire to spread. And ultimately, we also see this play out at a broad spatial scale, where we find that there are sites that are fuel moisture limited that have negative correlations between fire and annual rainfall. So we understand these dynamics fairly well in the modern today, and how they vary on annual and decadal timescales. But there's a question of how fire dynamics might respond to a long-term rainfall perturbation, which might be closer to the types of dynamics that we experience in the future. So we can ask this question, right? Do fire responses to the same large-scale hydrologic shift vary depending on the initial conditions at a site? So what I'm showing you here is data from the same Alvarado paper that looked at fire correlations across Africa with a correlation between fire and rainfall on the y-axis and the rainfall gradient on the x-axis. And you can see that sites that have positive correlations are all on the arid side of the savanna rainfall gradient and switch over to having negative correlations or moisture-driven dynamics on the more mesic side. So where a site sits could really affect how it responds to perturbation. And the other aspect of this too, and this is now showing data plotting savanna and forest sites across Africa based on the same data I showed on the first slide, because we know that savanna and forest states also shift depending on where you are on the gradient. So we have both vegetation and fuel load dynamics to think about. So the research questions I'm going to be addressing in this talk generally are, does paleo fire activity respond to long-term increases in increasingly wet conditions in the past? And if so, do responses to the same hydrologic shifts vary depending on the initial conditions of the site? And to test this out, I'm going to be using the African humid period as a test case. So the African humid period took place in mid-Holocene between about 4.7 to 5.5 thousand years ago. This was a period of a precessional maximum with increased rainfall across much of subtropical Africa. And this has been interpreted either as an increase in dry season rainfall or reduction in seasonality, or an increase in overall rainfall, and that's somewhat dependent on where you are in the site specifics. But this is a very widespread event that's been recorded in hundreds of records, and so it's a nice test case as a hydrologic forcing to ask our question about intra-site variability. So how I'm going to be getting at this is I'm going to be comparing fire activity response to the AHP between two different lake sites that sit at different places on the savanna rainfall gradient. So I'm going to be using sedimentary records from Lake Turkana and Lake Victoria, both of which are in East Africa. Lake Turkana is a more arid site, while Lake Victoria is a more mesic or humid site. And the reason that we chose these two sites is that they already have hydrologic records available in terms of the hydrogen isotopes of leaf waxes. So there's organic geochemical constraints that both show that these sites experience increasing rainfall amounts during the AHP. So we can make some predictions of how we might expect fire to respond at each of our two sites based on where they sit on the rainfall gradient. So Turkana, which is our more arid site, we have two potential hypotheses of what we might expect fire activity to do. Either fire activity may increase with increasing rainfall because we expect this site to potentially be fuel load limited. Another possibility is that fire activity might actually cross a threshold between a fuel limited and a moisture limited system, where initially we get increasing fire activity as rainfall increases, but then as you reach peak rainfall, you might actually get decreasing fire activity if you hit this moisture limited regime. At Victoria, we also have two alternative hypotheses that are different because we expect this site to have more mesic dynamics. One of the hypotheses is that we might expect fire activity to decrease with increasing rainfall because of those moisture limited dynamics. Another potential option for Lake Victoria is because it sits in this bistable region where savanna and forest can both be favored. There's a potential scenario where fire activity decreases with increasing rainfall, enough so that fire is inhibited completely, which might transition the site from a savanna to a humid forest. So the tool that I'm going to be using to test these dynamics is an organic geochemical tool called Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. These are a suite of compounds that are derived from biomass combustion. They're relatively recalcitrant and stable on long timescales. And in this case, they're useful in records where other paleoenvironmental proxies are used because they have more similar taphonomic properties. So in these two lakes, we have hydroclimate records that are from leaf waxes. So this is another organic geochemical tool. So it's comparing apples to apples instead of apples to oranges, which is potentially useful here. And we also are able to build off the work that previous authors, which are collaborators of mine, did to constrain the hydrology with the leaf waxes. So the one of the challenges of using PAHs as a fire proxy is that these compounds actually come from additional sources besides burning. They're also produced through thermogenic maturation processes, which means if you have old fossil carbon in your samples, this could potentially confound some of your paleo fire interpretations. But we have some tools that allow us to deal with this. One of which is that the alkylation patterns of PAHs are known to be related to their source. So PAHs that are produced through pyrogenic burning processes have this distribution where most of the compounds do not have alkylations, and you have progressively less alkylations, while compounds that are produced through petrogenic processes have more alkylations and have this more parabolic distribution. So we can use a multivariate method called non-negative matrix factorization, which allows us to extract N members from a set of complex samples to model out the amount of each of these N members that has to go into each sample to reconstruct the observed distribution. And this allows you to correct your samples back to your pyrogenic component. So this is the NMF method with the reconstructed N members for both of these lakes. And you'll notice that Turkana actually has a third N member as well. But this N member is actually interpretable. So this N member actually looks a lot like what the N member of some conifer burn products look like, where the maximum amount of compounds are dimethylated forms of phenanthrenes. And these dimethylated forms are more likely to be produced from conifers because conifers have a lot of resinous compounds that when they're combusted, break down to form phenanthrenes that have these dimethylations on them. And so we are interpreting this third N member as a conifer or gymnosperm dominated N member. We know from the paleo-environmental constraints of this site that this plant community is likely distal. And so what we're getting is this kind of distal component to the PAHs. But the good news is because we're correcting our PAH records using that pyrogenic factor, this shouldn't confound our interpretations of savanna fire dynamics of the site. And just to back up this interpretation, I want to show you another PAH index we sometimes use. It's retine, which is another conifer-derived compound divided by other PAHs of this size. And you'll see that in our record, it's very highly correlated to this third factor at Lake Turkana. So another thing that we sometimes do with PAHs as we can normalize their concentrations to a plant biomarker to account for shifts in fuel loads across the landscape when trying to reconstruct fire activity on long timescales. This also somewhat deals with preservational issues. I'm thinking about the amounts of PAHs in the record being related to stuff that might not have to do with paleo fire. However, in this case, we're actually interested in differences between fuel load and fuel moisture dynamics. So we didn't want to do that normalization, but we did analyze beta-amarin derivative, which is a commonly used compound that we can use to normalize our PAHs that's derived from angiosperms, and look at how that compound is varying with PAHs across both sites. And what you'll notice is that at Lake Turkana, there's a strong correlation between the beta-amarin derivative compound and the PAH record, while at Victoria, there isn't a very strong correlation. And this actually supports our interpretation and expectation that Lake Turkana is going to be a fuel load limited site, while Lake Victoria will be somewhat decoupled from fuel loads and will instead be fuel moisture limited. Okay, so now I'm going to get into some of this pH data. On the bottom, I'm showing you those hydrogen isotope leaf wax records. I just want you to note that the axes are flipped, so the more negative values are up and the more positive values are down. This is because more negative values indicate increased amount of factor increased rainfall. So these are two pH records in the terms of pH fluxes at the lake sites. You'll notice that at Lake Turkana, there's an increased amount of pHs during the AHP, while at Lake Victoria, there's this progressive decrease in pHs over the AHP. And as I mentioned, one of the things with these compounds is you want to make sure there aren't preservational issues that are affecting your interpretations. And we know that during this time, there were changes in the total organics in both of these lakes. So I also wanted to normalize these records to the total organics just to see if the same patterns were preserved. And what we find is that these pH patterns are still generally apparent when they're normalized to TOC. And so this gives confidence that these flux patterns are actually capturing a real paleo fire signal between the two lakes. So ultimately, together, our data at Turkana supports hypothesis 1, where fire activity increases with increasing rainfall. And the interpretation of this is that Lake Turkana, fire increased during the AHP, indicating that the site is fuel load limited throughout the full time period. So at Lake Victoria, we see a slightly different story. The data here supports hypothesis 2, the alternative hypothesis that fire activity will decrease with increasing rainfall, but the site might transition to a humid forest. And we're interpreting it this way because PAHs basically go down to nothing by the end of the AHP. They don't seem to fully bounce back. And there's also another pollen record that from previously published data from these same cores that indicates that there's increased moist forest contributions during the AHP at the expense of grasses. And so this really does seem to indicate that this site is fire is being excluded at this site and it's transitioning into a moist forest site. I do also want to briefly point out that another interesting thing with this data is that it's actually fully consistent with the interpretation that the increase in rainfall at this site is due to reduced seasonality rather than just an overall increase. This is something that's been suggested by previous modeling work and the oxygen isotopes of cereal teeth. And this is the reason that this supports that interpretation is that when you have a wetter wet season in these a wetter dry season in these moist sites, it really can fully exclude fire and allow these forests to expand. And so this dynamic of a reduced seasonality indicating a forest transition, favoring a forest transition is more consistent with the data. But so far, I've just showed you new data sets from 2 different sites. The AHP has been recorded at hundreds of sites across Africa. However, the fire story is a lot less developed, but there is some additional data from previously published work from 4 additional sites. And so together, if we combine these previously published records, most of which are from charcoal, but a couple of them have organics data as well, we get a full story with 6 different sites distributed across our rainfall gradient. And then we can analyze how fire is shifting, not just through time, but also through this rainfall space as well. So what I'm showing you here, I'm going to walk you through the data from all these sites. I'm showing hydrogen isotopes of leaf waxes, which are indicating the hydrologic proxy at each of these sites, where we know that the AHP has been constrained. And then the bottom record in red is showing you the fire activity in terms of z-scores. So it's been normalized for each site, and that's because each site is using a slightly different proxy. And so what you'll notice when I show the 3 most arid sites is that they all display this fuel load limited pattern where you have an increase in fire activity and then a decrease across the AHP. You'll also notice that the magnitude of this change flattens as you get into more and more humid sites. This is also something we would expect. A lot of that remote sensing data shows that the strength and correlation between rainfall and fire decreases as you move to more and more humid sites, even when you're in fuel load limited systems. Our middle site, which is Lake Tanganyika, actually displays dynamics that we can potentially interpret as a transition from a fuel load limited system to a fuel moisture limited system, where the site has an initial increase in fire activity during the AHP, and then a decrease as we get into that peak. And then finally, our two most humid sites both display this pattern where there's a decrease in fire activity as rainfall increases, and then fire activity actually basically bottoms out as you move into the maximum of the HP. And both of these sites actually have additional data in terms of the pollen data I showed you earlier, but also carbon isotope data indicating a transition from a C4 dominated landscape to a C3 dominated landscape. That ultimately is evidence that both these sites are transitioning from savanna to forest. So just to conclude, going back to our initial research questions, does paleo fire activity respond to long-term increasingly wet conditions? We find evidence across all of these sites that fire activity responded to the AHP. However, we found that these patterns shifted in different directions, really depending on the initial conditions at that site. So ultimately, I think the big takeaway from the paleo perspective here is because of these nonlinear fuel and fire behavior dynamics in these systems, it's going to be absolutely critical to consider initial hydrologic conditions, either when reconstructing paleo fire and savannas in the past or projecting fire responses to climate shifts in the future. So with that, I just want to end by acknowledging the many co-authors that helped with this work, as well as my funding sources, and I will take any questions now.
Thank you, Allison, for this very interesting plenary talk. Are there any questions? I see one. Allison, you have a question from Rashid Shadadi. Could you please comment on the seasonality effect? Is it the contrast between summer and winter in terms of amount of precipitation, or a PE or a T, and how does this seasonality impact fire? Thank you.
Great, yeah, I'll answer that live. So certainly, so it's the contrast in precipitation during the dry or wet season that really controls this effect, not really temperature. Because the temperature in these systems is not really the determinant of fire. These are really fuel load and fuel moisture driven systems. And so the reason for this is because you need time to cure your fuels after a wet growing season. And so if you shrink or reduce the amount of time that you have to do that, it can actually reduce and almost, and in some cases, fully exclude fire activity in the system. And so these moisture-driven dynamics are really responsive to seasonality, not just annual, a fully annual precipitation. I hope that answers the question.
I also hope so. We have another question from Bahru Azegagen. For modern, potentially future decrease of fire, what is the possible effect of the increase in human population in Africa because more places are falling under human control?
Yeah, definitely. So this trend of decreasing fire activity has been suggested to be due to human land use change. So areas that are being converted for agriculture, also increased livestock, because animals have a large effect on fuel load. So if you have a lot of cattle grazing, you can actually reduce the amount of fuels that are able to burn. And so this has been another suggested reason for that trend. So I think to project activity in the future, we're gonna have to consider all of these factors together, right? So the ways that humans are going to control or alter fuel loads and ignitions alongside how these climate variables that affect overall fire conditions are changing.
Great.
Okay.